What's up, guys, and welcome back to yet another episode of Chewing That Apologetics. I'm your host, Caden, the Trinitarian Trooper, and in today's video, we're actually going to be looking at my favorite argument for God, and also, in my opinion, the best argument for God, which is the Transcendental argument for God. Yeah, let's get right into it. Tag pretty much goes like this. Y is the necessary precondition for X, X, therefore Y. Let me kind of simplify that a little bit because it may sound a little confusing at first. Pretty much what this is saying is God is the necessary precondition for logic to even exist. Logic exists, therefore God exists. Now, I specifically target logic, but you can also use other things. Like you can go for universal truths and morality. So you could say, well, God is the necessary precondition for universal truths to exist. Universal truths do exist, therefore God exists. But I specifically like to target logic. And so the question that I'll ask to atheists, if you guys have been watching the channel and have seen my debate against two atheists, one Frobro and another woman on TikTok, the question that I ask is, what is your epistemic justification for logic?
I was just wondering what your basic epistemic foundation for the existence of logic was.
Right? What is your basic epistemic justification for the existence of logic? And so pretty much what I'm asking here is, how do you believe that logic exists? How does logic exist in your worldview? Now, this may sound like a pretty simple question, but this is actually such a struggle for the atheist to answer. And now you might hear some different answers from them, but they all fall short. I'm going to go over a couple that they might say, but first I actually want to go ahead and shut down something that you guys might be thinking. You might be thinking, well, Caden, that explanation you gave on tag, Y is a necessary precondition for X, X therefore Y, that sounds very circular. Two things. The first thing is it is circular, right? But in a way, like every worldview at the biggest level is circular, right? So every worldview at the biggest level is kind of circular. The question is it viciously circular? And the answer is no, right? So again, all we're saying is that God is the necessary precondition for logic to exist. We know that logic exists, therefore God exists because he's the only option for logic to exist. And I know that he's the only option because any explanation, any attempt that you make in order to explain logic without God simply always falls short, right? And you're always able to reduce it to an absurd. But real quick, I'm going to give some quick refutations that the atheists might try to make to this argument. And I'm going to tell you guys why they fall short and how exactly to go against them. The first refutation is it exists because it works.
Yeah, I'm asking you how you think it exists.
So how I think that logic exists?
Yeah.
Metaphysically. What's in our heads?
But what is the cause of logic?
Without logic, we wouldn't be talking right now.
Aaron, we're talking about, in your debate, what is your epistemic foundation for the existence of logic?
It works, so we use it. It works without any, it works. If you think logically, if you act upon a logical way of finding little truths here and there to build up a larger picture, it works. So it doesn't, I don't get I still don't understand why that was such a big deal.
See, this does not actually explain how logic exists. Yes, sure, it works. I know that. We all get that. None of us disagree on that. But that doesn't explain how it works. That's like saying, hey, how does this basketball exist? Oh, because it works. No, it exists because it was created in a factory, right? So this explanation here simply just falls short, right? Let's move on. The next refutation you might hear is logic exists because man created it. But this is also just not true. Actually, what logic is they are universal consistent patterns, right? So these are universal consistent patterns. They are not man-made. If they were man-made, then each culture could just make their own laws of logic, and then debate would actually not even be possible because they would just all be right according to their own standard or critique, right? So yeah, this doesn't actually make sense or explain it at all, because in that case, every person would be right and you could just come up with the laws of logic. No, instead, logic is not created, it is instead discovered. right? So we don't create logic, we discover it. And so these are consistent universal patterns that the atheist must justify. Why do these consistent universal patterns exist? How do these consistent universal patterns exist? And that's something really important to keep in mind. When you are using tag, those are the two most important questions, in my opinion, that you could answer. Why and how. Maybe not two most important questions, but two most important words that you can kind of spam, right? Why, how? Because what you're going to notice is some atheists kind of say things but don't really get to the bottom of it. You know what I mean? And what we're trying to do with tag is actually dig all the way down to the atheist presuppositions. I like to make this analogy. Your worldview is like a house, right? Your presuppositions are the foundation of your house. If you cannot justify those presuppositions, then your whole house falls down, right? So yeah, let's go on to another refutation. Another refutation that you might hear is simply the laws of logic do not exist. That is actually something I've heard before, is somebody just straight up say that logic doesn't exist. But yes, it does, right? Again, logic are universal, consistent patterns. Patterns do exist, right? So these are immaterial laws that exist. And what you'll notice with the atheists is that they will try to kick out the lawgiver, but keep the law. They'll try to kick out God, but keep the law of logic, right? So God is the lawgiver, but they just try to remove him and still try to justify logic, which is exactly why their position is absurd, because you can't justify the law without the lawgiver. It doesn't make sense, right? So, no. The laws of logic definitely do exist, right? And of course, there are, because if they didn't exist, then we would just be living according to some, we would be living in some sort of complex world, right? Where somehow the law of non-contradiction would be true and these things would be true. So, and then you would also have to define, you would also have to ask the atheist who says this, well, what do you mean by exist, right? How do you define existence? Because if they only define existence by physical existence, well, then you could dive into that and ask them why. Dig to the presuppositions of why that is the case and why they don't see immaterial things as existing things. So yeah, ask them those questions. Try to dig down to the bottom of that. And then to add on to that, what you want to ask to this atheist that denies the existence of logic is say, well, if only material things exist, how do we account for non-material, right? So immaterial, universal, consistent, unchanging patterns. If only matter exists, how do we account for the laws of logic? Now, there are more arguments that the atheist will try to use, more refutations that the atheist will try to combat you with. Those, I'll leave you to do your own research on those. This is a quick video on tag, right? Tag is pretty, I want to say pretty complex, right? It's one of the more big brain type of arguments for God, right? This is not like something simpler like the Kalam cosmological argument. This is the transcendental argument, right? So this might take you weeks to actually get. This is just a quick overview of it, right? Kind of an introduction to it. So yeah, let's keep going. So next I'm going to be telling you guys, and this is the last thing before I end the video. Again, a very quick video on tag. I've also done a live stream on tag, and I probably will talk about it more in the future, of course. But this is how you argue with tag. You want to first assume the unbeliever's worldview, right? You want to assume their worldview. And then what you want to do is perform a reductio ad absurdum, right? Reducing their presuppositions, their worldview to an absurd, right? Showing them that they simply cannot justify logic in their worldview. Then what you want to do is in the Christian worldview, then you want to ask the atheist to assume your worldview. You actually show that you cannot reduce the Christian worldview to an absurd, right? So you can reduce the atheist worldview to an absurd, but then after assuming their beliefs and their worldview and then reducing it to an absurd, you want to then ask them to assume your worldview, try to reduce it to an absurd, and then when it doesn't work, it shows that your worldview is actually more coherent. Now you might be asking, Caden, as a Christian, how do you think that logic exists? Now, I actually learned the transcendental argument, or not necessarily learned. I did learn some of it, but I was introduced to it by J. Dyer, right? And J. Dyer says that God created the laws of logic. I actually disagree here. I would say that the laws of logic are ultimately grounded in who God is. They're grounded in his very essence and his very nature, which explains why they're universal, consistent, and unchanging, right? And that also explains why God can't create a square circle. That explains why God can't do something illogical, because it is ultimately grounded in who he is. Yeah. Thank you guys for watching this video. I love y'all. If you enjoyed it, please hit that like and subscribe button. Again, there's a lot more diving in you could do. I think that for one of the refutations that the atheists try to give, which is like, logic just simply doesn't exist. I didn't really do a great job explaining why that position is wrong. But yeah, again, this is just a kind of introductory video to the transcendental argument. But definitely dive into it. But yeah, thank you guys for watching this video, and that's something to chew on.